Technology. Gotta love it. God. I think this is, oh. Perfect. We are streaming live on YouTube as we speak. So let me go ahead and mute YouTube. And let me introduce our esteemed, wonderful guests who have graciously agreed to give us a little bit of his time today. Again, of course, we have a Dr. Torrin Alexander who teaches Intro to Africana Studies at Winston-Salem State University. And we are joined by Dr. Corey D.B. Walker, who is right now currently Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities at Wake Forest University, where his research and teaching interests include Africana philosophy, critical theory, ethics, social and political philosophy, religion, and public life. He is author of A Noble Fight, African American Freemasonry and the Struggle for Democracy in America. He has just co-edited a book titled Community Wealth Building and the Reconstruction of American Democracy, Can We Make Democracy Work? Along with Melody C. Barnes and also Dad Williamson. He has an extensive bio, but since we have a little short time, and as you guys know, we generally kind of engage in a lot of ideas. I've had the pleasure to know Dr. Walker for a good amount of time for this past, I guess now over 6-7 years. Also knew of his work before. We have tons of mutual contacts and relationships that we have built over the years. And it was just a great fit for serendipitous, but also in line with the ancestors wanted for me to be able to come down to Winston-Salem State when Dr. Corey Walker was dean of the college at Winston-Salem State. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Dr. Walker. And today we're going to be engaging around the ideas and arguments in an article titled What Black Studies Is Not, written by Dr. Greg Carr. And what Dr. Walker is going to do is to really situate those ideas into larger questions around Africana studies, particularly moving in and out of his own intellectual formations and genealogy as well, starting there. So with that being said, sit back, take notes, enjoy the conversation. And if you do have questions, and I see in the chat a lot of the students who are here, this is a webinar, so it's a little bit different. So if you do have questions, there is the question and answer at the bottom of your screen that you can put those questions in there, and then we can also integrate them into the conversation today. With that being said, let's welcome, and I turn it over to Dr. Corey D.B. Walker.
Well, thanks so much, Professor Pope and Professor Alexander. It's like we're put back together. The band is put back together. I can still remember the fun that we had with the students at Winston-Salem State over in Hall-Patterson, BC, before COVID. But this is a great opportunity for us to get together. And I want to thank y'all for inviting me to speak on this important issue right now, because I think what Dr. Carr's essay does, and it's 10 years since that essay has been published. First in Socialism and Democracy, and then it's been republished and folks have been referencing it for a number of years. But it's a number of thoughts that Professor Carr has had since he was doing his work at Temple and long being a student activist at Tennessee State. So these ideas are important for us to continue. So today, what I'd like to do is to sort of highlight the key questions that's animating his thought and what that means for us in this particular moment when we're engaging in the project of Africana Studies at Winston-Salem State. So I've titled this, and I'm going to provide a little PowerPoint for you, and I can give this to Professor Pope so everyone can have a copy of it. What I've titled today's conversation is really what Africana Studies is and what it is not. And what we're going to do with that, if you notice the grapheme that's there, is/is not. We're going to think that slash. What is the nature of the relation between our understanding of Africana Studies and how those understandings or even those misunderstandings can challenge and strain us in realizing a fuller vision. And we're going to also, the second half of the title, Thinking Beyond the Limits of the Order of Knowledge, means that we're going to actually engage in an Africana Studies project that strains toward, that moves away from the dominant orders of knowledge to realizing a new terrain to begin to elaborate the conditions of critical thinking, the conditions of new possibilities, and the conditions of a new politics. I want to begin us with a statement. This statement comes to us from the 19th century. And like what Professor Carr reminds us of in that article is that Africana Studies is part of a deep intellectual genealogy. And that genealogy not only is circumscribed by a geopolitical entity we call the United States or throughout the Americas, that intellectual genealogy goes back to the continent itself. But when we want to begin to think about the project of Africana Studies as it becomes consolidated in the modern American Academy, it behooves us to remember that at the height of the Black freedom struggle in the 19th century, the idea to continue to challenge the slaveocracy in the United States and the global conditions that usurped the lives and life chances of the majority of the world's populations, a group of Africans in the Americas convened and were part of a convention movement that began to rethink the very fundamental coordinates of thought. And at the 1847 National Convention of Colored People, they understood that not only were they moving against a dominant political and economic order, they were also moving against a dominant intellectual order. And that meant that they understood that their political struggle was intimately connected with the elaboration of new modalities of thought. And it was there where they articulated this particular statement: we struggle against opinions. Our warfare lies in the field of thought. That means that the ways in which we think, the ways in which we cognate the world are intimately connected to the ways in which we want to struggle against the dominant orders of the world. And the ways in which we cognate liberation, freedom, new modes of being human, those are deeply contested notions. And the ways in which they are organized and ordered in the university means that those orders of knowledge are deeply contested. And what Africana Studies does is it raises that level of contestation to a level of critical consciousness, so that then we realize that these orders are not naturalized. Instead, they are institutionalized, and that they reinforce dominant political orders. So now what Africana Studies does, it retrieves that 19th century thought and then says, how do we then animate that in the 21st century? How do we understand that the project of liberation is unfinished? How do we begin to animate the understanding that Africana Studies is the intellectual arm of a broader freedom movement, a broader liberatory movement of all peoples across the globe? That's in 1847. Now I want to move us to the space of Winston-Salem State in 1969. Here, Brother Earl Hart, a long distance runner in the Black freedom struggle in Winston-Salem and at Winston-Salem State, launched a frontal assault on those intellectual orders that were then dominant at Winston-Salem State. And in the student newspaper, Brother Hart, writing under the title Yours in Blackness, offered not only this critique of the dominant order of knowledge at the university, he then left it with an open question that is a profound challenge, not only to the orders of knowledge then in 1969, but also the orders of knowledge today. Earl Hart writes, the courses offered at Winston-Salem State University range from Greek civilization to European Romance languages. When we review most of the curriculum on campus, we are able to find only a smidgen of courses which are meaningful to us as Black people. It is a prerequisite for graduation from Winston-Salem State University that students take at least one course in the humanities and 2 courses in modern European history. Were the Greeks and Romans the only human culture? What Earl Hart reminds us of is not only that the orders of knowledge institutionalize themselves in what's the accepted and legitimate curriculum and legitimate order of knowledge for not only Winston-Salem State, but also the Western world. He then punctures that order of knowledge by raising the fundamental question: were the Greeks and Romans the only human culture? In other words, Earl Hart is saying in 1969 on the pages of the student newspaper, the News Argus, which is still being published and printed today at Winston-Salem State, Earl Hart reminds us that there are more than one way, there's more than one way of being human in the world. And then he underscores the ideological work that's being articulated by stating that by the implied understanding that every student must take the humanities that's circumscribed by Europe, as well as modern European history, as if these are the only human cultures in existence. Now imagine what would happen if that understanding that question were then opened up for a reflexive reading of the curriculum, not only of Winston-Salem State University, but of the modern university writ large. Would we have the same university? This is the fundamental response of Black studies, saying you would not only have a different university, but you would possibly have an entirely different order of things. That's what Africana Studies does. It responds to the question that Earl Hart raises, cognizant of the historical statement of the National Convention of Colored Peoples in 1847, and states that there is another knowledge possible. There is more than one way of being human in the world. And of course, when we think of the formal project of African American studies, we think through 2 of the primary architects, these generative individuals that we have to think with in our genealogy and responding to Earl Hart's question, as well as the intellectual provocation coming to us from the 19th century. And here we're reminded of W.E.B. Du Bois, that towering intellectual who spans both the 19th and 20th century and whose intellectual project continues to reverberate in our intellectual imaginaries to this day. And in The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois posits another powerful and provocative question. In that opening essay of Our Spiritual Strivings, Du Bois responds to the ever unasked question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word. In other words, Du Bois refuses to define Blackness as a problem, Blackness as a pathology, or Blackness as something that must be solved by an order of knowledge external to the global condition of African peoples. Du Bois refuses that automatically and absolutely. And then Toni Cade Bambara, in her excellent edited collection of 1970, The Black Woman, an Anthology, raises Du Bois's response to not only an existential level, but an ontological level that even Du Bois could not understand in 1903. And here, what Toni Cade reminds us of is that when these experts speak, white, Black, and male, they turn their attention to the woman, the reports get murky, for they usually clump the men and women together and focus so heavily on what white people have done to the psyches of Blacks, that what Blacks have done to and for themselves is overlooked, and what distinguishes the men from the women forgotten. What Toni Cade does is reaches back to a statement prior to Du Bois, 1892, from Anna Julia Cooper, A Voice of the South, when Anna Julia Cooper writes, "When and where I enter, the entire race enters with me." So Du Bois cannot occupy the position of the honorary, isolated, imperial I in all of his maleness. Instead, Du Bois has to understand that the issue of human subjectivity is deep, complex, and dense. And Toni Cade Bambara reminds us of that. And Toni Cade reminds us that the knowledge is coming out of the experiences and the epistemologies of Black women and Black feminist thought and Black feminist theory. Reminds us that the punctures to the dominant episteme are elaborate an entire universe of possibility. So when Du Bois answers seldom a word, Toni Cade reminds us that absolute rejection opens up not only a new modality for the individual, but opens up a new way of thinking that extends to the universe itself. Now imagine what would happen if we fully embodied an Africana Studies that realizes that there is a world of thinking, a world of critical thought, and a world of being human in the world, beyond just the mundane of the given, and can elaborate new possibilities of being human from the rich, diverse, and deep resources of tradition that have yet to find their critical elaboration, that do not find their critical elaboration, but yet point us beyond the dominant order of knowledge. Imagine realizing an Africana Studies that is not preoccupied with Blackness as problem, Blackness as pathology, or Blackness merely circumscribed to the geopolitical dictates of the United States, but responds to the depth and dynamism of the very challenge of Blackness itself, and elaborating an order of knowledge beyond the dominant order. That's what this question, what Africana Studies is and is not, directs us to as students and as scholars. We not only have to learn those deep genealogies, we also then have to equip ourselves with the tools and the skills requisite to elaborate that new universe of meaning. That isn't something that's quickly done. Instead, that is something that we have to do with practice. So what we learn from this is that we provide an itinerary of thinking of what Africana or African American Studies is. And of course, we realize that African American studies, first and foremost, critically examines the world of meaning, thought, and expression of continental and diasporic Africans across space and time. What this means is that it engages that genealogical understanding. It connects us to thinkers like Tony K. Bambara, to W.E.B. Du Bois, to the Negro Convention, Negro National Convention of 1847, to those thinkers who elaborate great possibilities of meaning, alternative possibilities of meaning, and new modalities of being human. It is not merely just something preoccupied with white over black and its raciological correlates, because we understand that those modalities are purely ones that come into the moment of modernity. It does not exclude them, it does not erase them, it does not evade them, but it does not make them absolute. In other words, Africana Studies is a process of retrieval, a process of reconstruction, and a process of re-examination of the ways in which continental and diasporic intellectual practices contribute to human knowledge and understanding. And it is also linked with a liberationist ethic, and most importantly, a liberationist praxis. So when we think that we're engaged in a process that's purely trying to say, well, Black people are human, Black studies, Africana studies, African American studies begins from the very audacious assumption that Black people are human. It does not begin on the defensive. It asserts the very primal humanity of Black folk. Then when it begins to elaborate those intellectual conditions, those conditions that then span across geographic boundaries, it also begins to engage those expressions across temporal boundaries and creating a disciplinary order that can disrupt the very order of knowledge. Now that becomes thinking Africana studies beyond the dominant order of knowledge. That is what Professor Carr is talking about in that article that you've read, what Africana Studies is and is not. And of course, when you're thinking Africana Studies, it's good to have a graphic to begin to enable to organize your thought. So when you're thinking about Africana Studies in the classroom, your introductory class, you're thinking about the very order of the discipline of Africana Studies. You're thinking of how that order relates to the university, the very orders of knowledge, other disciplines and intellectual practices that are consolidated in the university. And you're also thinking the ways in which the discipline of Africana Studies, as it is contextualized in the university, connects to the broader society. It is what Vincent Harding writes about in 1974, the vocation of the Black scholar and the struggles of the Black community, when Harding writes that the university is but a mirror of the more fundamental conditions in society. But you have to now think of these interrelated aspects. And it is in that sweet spot right in the middle that we're beginning to engage and learn how to think in an Africana Studies manner. You're not only thinking the discipline, you're thinking the ways in which it interrupts and disrupts orders of knowledges, and then the ways in which it points to new practices of human sociality, new practices of organizations of society, and new possibilities for being human in the world. When we begin to do that, that critical genealogy of African American studies gives us some very critical points that Professor Carr animates and highlights in that article. One is Africana studies, African American studies must meet the challenge of space and time. It cannot just purely think that this particular moment becomes the absolute horizon for all human existence, all human understanding, and all human intellectual expression. It also must realize that the intellectual condition of Africana studies is not delimited purely to the geopolitical confines of the United States. In other words, it begins to think in a diasporic and planetary manner around a global African and a global Africana community. The ways in which Africans on the continent and in the diaspora have created critical intellectual responses in relationship to human expressions of ultimate human value, whether it be at the National Negro Convention in 1847, whether it is the expressions of the Lusophone world in the Americas and Brazil, or whether it is in the intellectual expressions throughout the continent since the beginning of time. So we're always having to meet that challenge of space and time and realize that it is not only the hegemony of the present does not absolutely dictate, dominate, and direct the intellectual agenda. Secondly, in creating this genealogy, you're reminded that you're always tracking those intellectual practices that respond to a modern condition of the suppression of language, culture, texts, and practices of global Africana peoples. That in the moment of modernity, that moment of the emergence of the modern era and the consolidation of the intellectual orders in the modern university, that there comes that comes as a result of the elevation of a singular example of intellectual practice and intellectual culture to the denial and denigration of global examples of intellectual cultures, intellectual practices, and deep intellectual ideas. So when we have that moment of imposition in the modern era, that's then consolidated and institutionalized in the modern university, we begin to track those responses to those dominant conditions, elaborated by our highlighting of the National Negro Convention, or the ways in which Du Bois begins to challenge the dominant intellectual conventions of his day, and the ways in which Tony Cade reminds us that the impositions of these conventions, even in our modern moment, deny and denigrate the deep intellectual reserve of particular Black feminists and Black women's intellectual practices. We're also reminded that in this moment, Blackness emerges on the global scale as a primary signification of relations of power, meaning Blackness is denigrated. Blackness is understood as the negative. This is not an absolute ontological condition, but yet an existential condition that comes out of a system of relations of power that emerge in the modern moment. These intellectual conditions, as well as their material correlates in a world governed by a chattel slave logic, as well as a capitalist political economy that then renders bodies as property and as redundant and as labor and as ways in which that surplus value can be extracted, but also the ways in which Blackness operates axiologically to then serve as the reserve value of everything that is negative, everything that is negative, everything that is negated, but most importantly, everything that does not rise to the level of the ideal human. So Blackness is a series of relations of power. Remember, that doesn't mean that Africans, both continental and diasporic, do not think and understand themselves to be human, but there are relations of power that seek to deny that humanity and deny it within the intellectual registers of the dominant organization of knowledge and the dominant order of things. There also comes, as Professor Carr reminds us, of the intellectual bifurcation between European and non-European knowledges. There is a way, and the modalities of modernity reminds us that the quintessential expression of human rationality and of reason finds its unique genius in European man. And what you have there is that European man provides us with reason. All other knowledges provide us with the data. This is the famous example when Frederick Douglass was speaking about the philosophy of slavery that went beyond just a description of the condition of slavery, but an analysis of the relations of power that undergirded the slavocracy in the Americas and undergirded the order of the world. Frederick, in his philosophical exposition, was reminded, Frederick, you take care of the experience. We will take care of the philosophy. And of course, at that moment, Frederick broke with that movement and began to elaborate those conditions of possibility beyond that dominant order of knowledge. And of course, Professor Carr reminds us of two important factors in our critical genealogy of African American studies. One is we have to develop narratives and understand what those narratives of Black studies mean. And we have to understand that genealogy means a number of things, both linkages, continuities, as well as discontinuities, moments of rupture, well as a repetition of normative categories, as well as ways in which we improvise on those intellectual conditions. To go back to those narratives of Black studies, this goes back to what Brother Earl Hart wrote in the News Argus in 1969. Earl Hart was looking for a new practice of intellectual life, a new practice of organizing the curriculum, and a new intellectual order. What Dr. Carr reminds us of is that there was a competition, not a competition, think of it as there was competing positions being advanced. One that saw Black studies in the university, as the Yale group headed by Armstead Robinson in their 1968 classic Black Studies in the University, as well as those individuals who understood that there needed to be a dominant order of Black studies, that a new order of the university. That's where they came with the Black University. That's at Howard University, beginning in 1967 with Charles Hamilton Hamilton articulating the need for a Black university at that conference. And of course, Negro Digest Black World having a series of issues dedicated to the Black university from that moment on up through the 1970s. So there's a way in which we have to begin to understand that Black studies is not only a disciplinary quest, but there's a broader quest for Black studies to understand itself as a quest around thinking and order of knowledge beyond the current order of knowledge, beyond just that which is encapsulated and institutionalized in the university. This is what Earl Hart understood in 1969 at Winston-Salem State University. And of course, Hart knew that there was a discontinuity between that intellectual project and what he understood as the curriculum of the humanities and the curriculum that was fully ensconced within the university in 1969. So when we think of the Africana Studies project, or when you begin to engage this, you're beginning to engage it around a number of issues. You understand it as a strategic and corrective project, that it's strategic in the ways in which it deploys new knowledges, new ideas, and new categories to begin to correct and also to elaborate the conditions of possibility for and other knowledge. It is also engaged in a descriptive as well as an analytical project. It seeks to elaborate and retrieve and reconstruct those expressions of African being, knowledge, and existence and expressions in the world and also begin to analyze what those expressions means, particularly in relation to the experiences and ideas of continental and diasporic Africans across space and time. It also incurs an ethical moment, a moment of how it reflects on its own normative assumptions as an intellectual enterprise, as an intellectual practice, but it also begins to engage in a prescriptive dimension where it seeks to respond to pressing critical issues facing the global African community. So when you think of Africana Studies, it is an intellectual discipline that is strategic and corrective, descriptive and analytical, normative and prescriptive. That's why you're constantly beginning to think through not only these genealogies, but more importantly, beginning to understand how we elaborate the conditions of what Black studies is and what it is not. And of course, this is intimately linked with a practice of the university that goes beyond just the order of things in our contemporary moment. And here, W.E.B. Du Bois serves as a guide for us. But as guide, we're also looking for those signature moments where we begin to elaborate new conditions. And here we have W.E.B. Du Bois reminding us that the university is not just a center of knowledge. It is that, and that is important. But it must also be a space where knowledge can help guide and inform our actions that lead to the critical liberation of Black communities. And the example connected with this is the example right up the street in Greensboro, North Carolina, first started in Durham, North Carolina by the students at North Carolina Central University and Duke University, Malcolm X Liberation University. Started in 1969, it closed its doors roughly around 1973, 1974. But here was a moment where groups of students, Black students, and also organizers, people like Owusu Saduki, people like Jerry Walker, people like Ed Whitfield, were beginning to elaborate how do we create a university that not only responds to the conditions of elaborating new knowledge in beyond the dominant order of things, but then how does it respond to the conditions of the Black community in our moment? And how can we then develop models that can help us respond to global conditions in the Black community? Malcolm X Liberation University becomes an example that informs us of the deep intellectual trajectories of the Black Studies movement, as well as the ideas of the Black university. So I want to also, in closing, I want to invite you, if you have some time Sunday, we're going to explore these ideas more with our dear friend Ed Whitfield. He's part of the Cornell University class of 1970, part of that class that elaborated the conditions of African-American studies at Cornell University. And in 1970, Ed Whitfield came down to Greensboro, North Carolina to work with the group of scholars, activists, and organizers at Malcolm X Liberation University. And from 1970 on, he's given himself over to being an activist and organizer throughout Greensboro and throughout the nation. That is the intellectual practice and genealogy that you are connected with at Winston-Salem State University. One that reminds you of the statement from 1847 that this is a battle, also a battle of ideas, that connects you with the practices of a Tony K. Bambara and a W.E.B. Du Bois, that also reminds you that the questions that you're engaging now, the issues that you're confronting now are ones that have been confronted and actually raised in the intellectual practice of one like Brother Earl Hart, who reminds us, are the Greeks and Romans the only human culture? And of course, The response is they're not the only ones. And the response from you is that you're building that intellectual genealogy in Africana Studies at Winston-Salem State University to remind and to also renew generations past and generations in the future of this intellectual genealogy, of this intellectual work, as you begin to do that work and respond to Brother Hart in 2021 and say, of course not. And this is how we do it. That's what Professor Greg Carr reminds us of. And that's the critical issues that you're confronting today. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you very much for that very, very and insightful and very, very rich conversation. And it's funny because, again, I've mentioned to our students a few times that, we all actually taught this class together, me and you, a number of times before. And then, of course, we have our good colleague, Dr. Torrin Alexander, who joined us a little bit later. So, there was one particular question from the student in the class, and she wanted you to kind of repeat the notion of when Frederick Douglass was told European teachers reason. She wanted you to kind of repeat that, what was said, but also, kind of expand upon that in three different ways, right? One of them is to really talk about this normative and prescriptive categorization of Africana Studies, why that is important. It's one thing to just make normative assumptions. So what are those normative assumptions, and why does Africana Studies deal with them in a duality, not just in these, very silo, narrow ways. And I think that will also lead to, when you mentioned existential, but also ontological. Talk about those, answer that question into that particular, that frame of reference for us. Thank you.
So the first one, I think one of the students raises a very important question. And that question, I use the example of Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass was confronted with a similar dilemma. And of course, Angela Davis, and I'm giving you a number of citations, Angela Davis, in her unfinished lecture on liberation, uses that moment of Frederick Douglass's rejection of Covey, his vehement fight with Covey, as an elaboration of a new modality of existence, a new possibility for philosophy, and a new understanding of what it means to be human in the world. I'm picking up on that, on Frederick Douglass's confrontation with John Collins of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. And this is where Douglass is confronted with a dilemma. Does not just want to describe what happened to him in the condition of slavery. Instead, Douglass understood that he's not only human, but that the condition of slavery is deeper than just a descriptive, is deeper than just describing it. It goes to the very analysis of the organization and relation of knowledge and power in the modern world. So Douglass began to elaborate those philosophical underpinnings of slavery and slavocracy in the United States. And of course, what John Collins reminded Douglass of was of an order of knowledge. The dominant order of knowledge renders the Black as a biographical, descriptive project, and the white as the project, as the theoretical, intellectual project. So with the Black, you only get biography and the experience, but with the white, you get the theory, the intellect, and the analysis. This is what, when Douglass began his critique of the very foundations of American democracy, this is what Collins responded to him exactly. Douglass, give us the facts. We will take care of the philosophy. That is what we're talking about when you have those distinct realms of thought. The European, which gives us the process of the project of reason, gives us intellect, and gives us theory. And these others, which are the data, the objects of that theory, that reason. This is why Du Bois, when he says how to the question, how does it feel to be a problem? Du Bois responds, I answer seldom a word. He is rejecting that dominant order of knowledge, those theories, those ideas that then render him within that order as problem, as pathology, as a project to be fixed by that dominant order of knowledge. Du Bois refuses it. So does Douglass, and so does Tony K. Bambara. So that's part of this process. That's part of the Africana process of understanding that Africana studies is not purely a response to those dominant orders of knowledge that then renders Blackness as pathology, Blackness as problematic, or Blackness as something to be fixed within that dominant order of knowledge. It undermines that, critiques it, and elaborates the conditions of possibility for a new order of knowledge. Now, this is related to what Professor Pope wants us, Professor Pope reminds us of the normative and prescriptive dimensions, because there are normative theories, assumptions, and categories that not only guide this project of Africana studies, but also remind us that there are certain orders of knowledge that serve as these reflexive checks on how we know our knowledge, and then how that knowledge can become sufficient as a condition of possibility for elaborating new modes of knowing and new knowledge formations. We also then connect that to an ethical practice, not only an ethic of the scholar, the student in Africana studies. It is also connected with a larger ethical practice of elaborating new conditions of being human in the world and new, more humane frames of reference for society and for human sociality. So in all, what you're seeing in Africana studies, and the example of Douglass in the 19th century becomes this exemplary moment, is that you're connecting the experiences of Africana students, the experiences of Africana peoples across space and time, their expressions of being human in the world, those multiple expressions of being human in the world, as well as those conditions of knowing and those conditions of understanding across space and time. You're connecting that with an intellectual practice. That experience, those expressions are being connected to an intellectual practice of how we begin to develop new ways of thinking, new categories of thought, new concepts to frame our human experience that then contribute to the reservoir of human knowledge and understanding. And you're connecting that with an ethical practice of how do we create a more humane world in society and across the globe. It is not purely a simple rejection of, Europe, all right? I mean, an impoverished notion would be that Black studies rejects Europe and then replaces it by Africa or some idea of Africa. That still inhabits the same dominant and domineering intellectual project. This means we want to do something new. That's what Tony Cade says. It's not just replacing one dominant order by another dominant order. Vivian Gordon, another scholar in Black studies, underscores that. And I know you're reading Vivian Gordon in your class. So you don't just replace one dominant order with another. Instead, you're retrieving, you're reconstructing, and you're re-examining to then elaborate new possibilities and new understandings built on those long genealogies of thinking and those long genealogies of intellectual practice.
No, thank you very much. And and that was very, very important to tie into the specific arguments and the main arguments of what Dr. Greg Carr was doing in this particular piece. And this is just one particular article that is in a range of genealogy of folk who are thinking about this in a more robust fashion, particularly in this time and period. What Black Studies is not. That article is a critique, it's an analysis, it's a prescription of Africana Studies, while at the same time presenting what Africana Studies is. So it's kind of like it's a backwards way, or a very, very critical engagement. You have to break down these normative ideas and these dominant forms of knowledge in order to flatten out or to make not this vertical approach to knowledge production and access, but traditionally in the context of African systems of knowing and systems of thought, there's a flattening out. There's a spread, there's a commonality, there's a collective process of building knowledge in order to advance ideas that are centered around humanity. And this becomes very, very important in this particular, and I keep saying particular, but in this time right now. But I wanted to give you, obviously, just a few more minutes if you have some closing thoughts. And again, I encourage everyone to check out those conversations that you are curating over at Wake Forest, using our new technology, using these forums. This is very important. We actually have more and more access to more and more people, but also just a really quick note, and I'll let you, a colleague, Dr. Abdullah Kalimat was writing about, the uses of technology. So I guess you can mention a little bit of that, his work, but also your closing comments. And thank you again for spending your time with us.
When you think about the global human condition and the planetary issues that we confront, the dominant issue being the future of organized human society, because we face two existential crises: global climate change and the threat of nuclear annihilation. That threat of nuclear annihilation becomes even more prescient and more pressing, rather, with the development of AUKUS, the Australia-UK-US Pact that was announced yesterday for the Indo-Pacific region, where the US, for the first time since the 1950s, will share its nuclear technology for building nuclear-powered submarines with Australia. Prior to this, it only shared that technology with the UK. Nuclear-powered submarines can go under, are less well detected than conventionally powered submarines. So that begins to destabilize that Indo-Pacific region even more because China sees this as a threat. And this goes all around shipping lanes. This is about global trade, and this is about geopolitical strategy. So as we confront these pressing issues, what Black Studies responds to is a deep genealogy of thought around how we begin to live in a more humane existence and in a more sustainable world, not in opposition to the earth, but in relation to the earth as part of creation. So we now need to retrieve that deep environmental thought of African and African diasporic peoples to then influence the ways in which we organize society beyond just saying that our cups can be recycled, but how do we begin to live in a more sustainable manner? It may be that we have to reorganize all of society because of the existential crises that we face. And we could see that just yesterday with the floods in Richmond, where thunderstorms that stall give us 2 to 3 inches of rain in an hour because a warmer atmosphere holds more rain. We need new thinking how to confront this existential challenge. We also need new thinking to confront the geopolitical challenge. It's not just about, as we engage in these resource wars, where Africa becomes the background for all of this context, we need to really elaborate a new order of geopolitical engagement. That's going to be important for us. Africana Studies has the resources to respond. Those resources, whether it's Nathan Hare's concept of Black ecology that's now being reanimated around dark ecologies and Black ecologies from a number of scholars, particularly young scholars across Black studies. When we think of the ways in which we understand global geostrategy, particularly when we look at the ways in which we understand new global politics, we're going to need Black studies students and Black studies scholars who can do that work. And I am reminded of none other than C.L.R. James when he articulated his vision of Black studies in the university and in Western society, when he stated, and I'll quote him, "Now, to talk to me about Black studies as if it's something that only concerned Black people is utter denial. This is the history of Western civilization. I can't see it otherwise. This is the history that Black people and white people and all serious students of modern history and the history of the world have to know. This intellectual project, much like what James was reminding us of when he returned to the US and started teaching at the University of the District of Columbia in the 1970s, this is a global project about being human in the world. And the knowledges, the ideas, the critical thinking and the training that students receive in Africana Studies can enable us to respond to the most pressing problems that we face and the future of our planetary existence. That is what Black Studies is. And that is what Black Studies must be as we move into the long future.
Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Coy Walker. And as you know, I'm always in gratitude for the generosity of your time and of your intellectual contributions to this thing that we call Africana Studies, that is moving to a higher level, as Fred Moten and folk will talk about. It's a Black study, but also this notion of really building a sustainable institution built upon the genealogies of those who were engaged in moving struggle for against power through knowledge development. Those folk, those scholars without portfolio who were informing these young folk in the communities for centuries and for decades before Africana Studies itself moved into the academy. Now, moving into the academy here in the 21st century, that's a different conversation, because we now have to really start to assess the impact of that. Now, this is not to say that those questions were not, at the beginning there, because folk were, well, what will be the implications of Africana Studies, moving into the academy? So I'll allow you to respond to anything I just said, but again, thank you for, being with us.
Well, thank you for allowing me to join you. Thank you to the class. Introduction to African American Studies, Introduction to Africana Studies at Winston-Salem State is so vitally important. The spaces of our Black colleges as intellectual spaces to elaborate this intellectual project is so vitally important and connected to the ways in which the project is elaborated in spaces like Wake Forest University, spaces like Howard University, Harvard University, as well as the ways in which it's elaborated outside of the university. We think of these as a continuum. This is an intellectual front, and they're all intimately connected. We need not think antagonistically. We need to begin to think, agonistically. We can have struggle in between these sites, but at the same time, that struggle is generative of refining ideas and elaborating new conditions of the project. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited that the students at Winston-Salem State are so committed to it. They're picking up and responding to that question that Earl Hart raised in 1969. And we're seeing that the endless possibilities of responding to an open question. That's what the university at its best facilitates. And when we think of the university, we think of those spaces, much like the classroom that you and Professor Alexander are convening, as really the promise of the best of what the university can do. It is inside the classroom that the university becomes real. And it is in the process of that dialogic engagement and exchange between students and teachers and the community that the university realizes a new life. So I'm excited, and I want to thank you. I love teaching Introduction to African American Studies. You know that. I've been teaching it for 2 decades, and I'll keep teaching it. That is, I get to learn something new, and the question that was raised by your students today was just amazing, and I want to thank them for allowing me to share some time with them.
Thank you again, and we will